In the aftermath of the Great War, it's difficult to separate fact from fiction, history from myth, truth from legend. What is never in doubt is that in the autumn of 2281, a courier accepted a parcel that would change the course of their lives and the entire Mojave forever. This account is just one of the many that follow the courier through their journey. This is Legends of the Mojave. Every one of his senses were assaulted the instant he entered the strip. The flashing lights beckoning visitors to the various casinos were nearly impossible to ignore. Blindingly bright, colorful, strobing, flashing, scrolling, distracting. Meanwhile, a sea of muffled voices, all competing for supremacy, coalesced into a confused melee, impossible to comprehend and equally difficult to ignore. Above it all, the music being blasted from the casinos, the barkers, hawkers, hecklers, and hookers hollered, waved, danced, and otherwise sought the courier's undivided attention. If he thought the streets of Freeside smelled like piss and vomit, the freshness of the strip's interpretation on such odors surely served to quickly change his mind. Even the air seemed to hang heavy over this place, a fog of tobacco smoke and alcohol vapors mixed with the body odor of 1,000 degenerate gamblers, well-worked prostitutes, and soldiers who had come straight from patrolling the Mojave without the courtesy of a shower beforehand. It seemed to cling to his skin, his clothing. He even swore he could taste it a little bit when he tried to alleviate the problem through mouth breathing, and made him instantly miss the open desert. He was finding it difficult to focus on the task at hand, and looking back at Veronica, it was clear even she was struggling with the state of this place despite her brotherhood training, and was just as powerless to make sense of this place. Thankfully for them, a direction had already been chosen. As he looked back toward the strip, he found himself staring face to face with a securitron. Not one of the army of patrolling bots working to keep the streets in order, but an H&H tool company made Robco Security Model 2060B, sporting a friendly-looking cowboy on the monitor, Victor. Were it not for the cacophony overpowering his senses, he might have been frightened, or perhaps it was simply that this wasn't the first time Victor had popped up out of nowhere to inject himself into the courier's personal bubble. But strangely, the courier wasn't really thrown off by Victor's presence this time around. Victor exchanged a few pleasantries before extending an invitation on behalf of Mr. House, the mysterious entity who ruled Vegas with an iron fist, who had never granted an audience to anyone, the king of the strip himself. When asked why a robot was delivering the message, Victor simply said it was the least he could do for his creator. As he signed off, the friendly cowboy on the monitor was replaced with a menacingly tough police officer, and the securitron rolled on to resume its beat. It was in this instant that one of the courier's greatest questions about Victor was answered. He had always wondered how it was that Victor always seemed to be one step ahead of him, shadowing his journey, keeping tabs. Now it was apparent that Victor wasn't a single securitron at all, but rather was a personality subroutine built into several, perhaps all, securitrons. It also made it far more than mere possibility that the cowboy robot that Johnson Nash said commissioned the Mojave Express to hire the courier in the first place was Victor all along, as any securitron out in the desert could feasibly serve as a vessel. As he approached the Lucky 38, another securitron sporting Victor's face was already guarding the door. He stepped inside the Lucky 38, long abandoned. There were no dealers, no cashiers, no barkers, no hookers, no gamblers. It was eerily silent, but a welcome change from the bustle of the strip. In the center of the casino floor was another Victor guarding an elevator. It was in this moment that the courier had to wonder if Mr. House wasn't a figment created by Victor himself, a ruse to instill public adoration for an imaginary benefactor rather than a parasitic personality subroutine. He rode the elevator up to the penthouse suite and came face to screen with a new securitron personality, Jane. Unlike Victor, Jane was a model PDQ-88, though it wasn't completely apparent what the differences between her and Victor's models actually were. Apparently, Mr. House had based her personality on his favorite girl, and Jane and some of the other girls worked diligently to entertain Mr. House. When pressed on what she meant by that, she said she attended to all of House's needs, adding that a lady doesn't kiss and tell, but between you and me, I think she had just done exactly that. The courier had a shiver run down his spine as he thought back to the weird stuff that James Garrett was likely getting up to with Fisto back in the Atomic Wrangler. I guess there's no accounting for taste. Snapping himself out of it, the courier bid Jane farewell and leaned over the banister. Below, flanked by a pair of police model securitrons, he saw a large array of computers and monitors, some tuned to security cameras monitoring the strip and beyond. But the main monitor, the large one in the middle, sported the image of a dapper, well-groomed man. The image was static, obviously just a portrait rather than a live camera feed. As he glanced back at Victor guarding the elevator once more, he understood the person on the other end could be just about anyone or anything in reality. Still, it was time to meet the King of New Vegas. Robert Edwin House was the president, CEO, and sole proprietor of New Vegas, apparently unbothered by the fact that such titles, when combined, spelled dictator just as clearly as Kaiser or president for life. Regardless, he claimed to have been the sole ruler of the Strip since 2274, when he sent his Securitrons out to retake the Strip, and the families, after swearing fealty, began to rebuild the Strip according to House's directions. When the Courier implied he was just a computer, House made it a point to correct him, stating that he was flesh and blood, not silicon. He was close-lipped about how he had managed to survive the centuries that had passed since the Great War, but he did claim to have enough knowledge regarding human longevity to fill several textbooks, and perhaps someday might market the tech he had developed to others, possibly even to the Courier. He glanced back up at the stairs at Jane, House's top gal, who saw to all of House's needs, and then behind him at the dull gray wall that had long since lost its pigment, the only sight House could possibly see from this computer bank when he wasn't speaking to summoned minions. The Courier could think of no greater hell than to take him up on that offer. As he and House descended into discourse, it became clear that House did not care much for the average everyday resident of New Vegas. He viewed them as nothing more than tools, playthings, fools, and nobodies who freely handed their life savings up to him in hopes of one day being seen as important. House, on the other hand, saw himself as important. He attributed importance to the Courier as well, often speaking of the two almost as equals, but the Courier wasn't about to be drawn in by this. As he had crossed the vast Mojave Desert, he often found himself a tiny speck amongst an ocean of factionalism and violence on a societal level. His only saving grace hadn't been his social standing, his importance to others, even his intellect. It was almost solely by being positioned in the right places at the right times with the right number of bullets and guns to fire them. House was clearly shining him on, and he wasn't going to blindly trust or follow a man whose very existence couldn't be verified. For all the Courier knew, this was just another Securitron sporting a few more vacuum tubes and a few more KB of RAM than usual, simply executing some pre-war directive after a long period of hibernation, just like the army of Securitrons that appeared from nowhere to conquer and rebuild Vegas in the first place. The Courier decided to take charge of the conversation. He wanted to know what House wanted with him. Once all the pretense was dropped, House could be surprisingly concise. Benny had stolen the platinum chip, House wanted it back, and it was the Courier's job to bring him the chip. In House's mind, it was as simple as that. House did make a generous offer of paying 4 times the original bonus promised in his contract with the Mojave Express, which the Courier negotiated up to 5 times, not that it mattered much now anyway. The Courier was draped head to toe in the finest armor available, had access to some of the most powerful weaponry one could ask for, and had now secured for himself a passport onto the Strip. The money was hardly a legitimate concern, but the fact that House was so desperate to receive a glorified gambling token meant there was far more to the object of everyone's fascination than a simple hunk of rare metal. Before setting off to deal with Benny, the Courier used his audience as a chance to get as much intel as he could about his target and the Strip in general. For someone who was supposedly completely blind as to what happens in each of the major casinos, House sure did seem to know a lot about Benny's habits. Granted, he was House's primary agent on the Strip before he attacked the Courier. Still, House had what seemed like solid info. He told the Courier to seek out a man named Swank, someone who had enough influence to deal with Benny, but the Courier wanted this ended on his terms, not the chairman's. Plus, he couldn't risk Benny catching wind that he was on the Strip and out for blood. He did learn that the reason House didn't use Victor to stop Benny from seizing the platinum chip in the first place was due to limitations in the amount of control he can exert on a Securitron at distance. Over such a long range, small packets of data are all that can be sent, and with Victor being the only Securitron in the Good Springs area and still running more or less stock behavioral routines, Victor simply calculated that he was no match for Benny in the cons and had to hang back until the deed was already done. When pressed for more information on the platinum chip itself, House was especially secretive. It was important, it had something to do with computers, and that was about it. For now, the Courier had learned everything he could. House comped him the high roller suite, even allowing the Courier to invite guests to stay there. So the Courier asked Veronica to stay at the high roller suite. He had grown to deeply respect her, but what he was about to do, he had rather not have her bear witness. For better or worse, he would either come back a man forever changed, or he wouldn't come back at all. And he didn't want her to feel responsible in either event. He didn't want her to remember him like that. He stepped back onto the strip alone, once again assaulted by the desensitizing din. He headed further down the strip until he found himself standing in front of the Tops Casino, Benny's headquarters, his home, his castle. And if the Courier had his way, Benny's grave. He stepped inside and was immediately accosted by a security guard. No weapons were allowed in the casinos. Using some tricks he had learned sneaking around the Mojave, he kept a small .22 caliber pistol hidden away and handed the rest of the weapons over to the guard. Stepping onto the casino floor, it was clearly cleaner and more well lit than the Atomic Wrangler and Freeside or the Vicky and Vance and Prim, but the overall aesthetic was pretty much the same. Gaudy decor, finely dressed people handing over their children's inheritance, believing they'd be able to get it all back and then some. A cashier's counter overlooking the casino floor, and on the far end of the gambling floor, hanging out and waiting to glad hand the high rollers, Benny. Still wearing that plaid jacket, surrounded by no fewer than 4 bodyguards, exactly as House had predicted. The Courier needed to keep an eye on Benny, to wait for him to dismiss his bodyguard or to await an invitation. So as had become his custom, he marched up the steps to the cashier's counter, exchanged some NCR dollars and Legion denarii for gambling chips, and returned to set up shop at the blackjack tables where he had a perfect view of Benny. But from this distance, with his fine armor and first recon beret gifted to him by Boone back in Novak, he was easy to mistake for just another NCR trooper here to gamble away his paychecks. As with the Atomic Wrangler, the gifts presented to gamblers on a hot streak were essentially worthless. Vodka, wine, and Brahmin steak, items which were next to worthless out in the desert, but made a city slicker feel like they were actually getting somewhere in life, like they had earned something. Enough to convince them to gamble long enough to stake everything when the odds favored the house. He did eventually win enough to be comped to stay in the high roller suite at the Tops. This might be a real achievement if it weren't for the privacy afforded by the Lucky 38 suite that House had already gifted him. But as with all things on the strip, the fake smiles and paltry gifts eventually ran out when he won one too many hands of blackjack. Cut off from gambling and unceremoniously evicted from the gambling tables, there was little else to be done. He started walking toward Benny. By now he had to have known the guy in the armor was clearing the tables, so hopefully Benny might be caught off guard by the big shot looking to introduce himself to the head of the family. Off guard was one way of putting it, but manically frantic would probably be more accurate. Benny needed to get the Courier out of sight. He knew things could turn bad for him if people learned who the Courier was and how exactly he had come to know Benny. He tried comping the Tops presidential suite. I guess the Courier now had 3 homes away from home on the strip. But the Courier couldn't be dissuaded from settling his business with Benny. He convinced Benny to ditch his bodyguards, and the two of them set off to the presidential suite together. It was all the Courier could do not to draw his little silenced .22 right there on the casino floor, but this was not a good position to be in, and vengeance would mean nothing if he died along with Benny. For now, restraint would have to be his soul-defining virtue. Benny rode the elevator up first, and then the Courier followed. When he arrived, he found Benny already posted up at the suite's bar, waiting patiently. But first, Benny had some questions of his own about how the Courier survived and managed to track him all the way across the Mojave, from Good Springs to his lair here in the Strip. He sounded surprised that House seemed to have been aware of his actions from the start, but seemed strangely unconcerned by the ramifications of this new turn of events. Benny was also strangely forthcoming with information. He filled the Courier in as best he could. The platinum chip was some sort of data storage device, but so far Benny couldn't figure out how to actually access the data. He only knew that the data was what House needed to stack the odds in his favor, as if an army of robots and 3 loyal tribes of followers weren't already enough to keep the likes of the Legion and NCR at bay. It seems Benny's main goal was to take over the Strip, but to do that, he had to wrestle control of the securitrons away from House, and he believed the platinum chip was the key to doing that, as well as possibly upgrading them and making them even more of a formidable force than they already were. The Courier spent some time arguing the finer points of morality, trying fruitlessly to convince Benny that his actions were insane, especially in light of the fact that House knew what he was up to. But Benny was too far gone. He was committed to his course of action. The die was cast and he had placed his bets. By Vegas standards, Benny wasn't half bad in the end. To some degree, he seemed to genuinely regret rearranging the Courier's gray matter and stated it was never personal, just business. He needed the platinum chip and couldn't afford for House to learn about his involvement in the robbery. The Courier, at the end of the day, was just a loose end. But as he sat there trying to buy the Courier's loyalty, a man he had literally shot and buried alive, there was a fine line between delusions of grandeur and suicidal stupidity. Finally, the Courier could stand no more. He demanded that Benny hand over the platinum chip. Benny simply declined, left his offer of employment open, and tried to send the Courier away. This final insult was more than the Courier could bear. He could no longer contain himself. All at once, every raw emotion that the Courier had been keeping buried inside rushed to the surface. The pain of waking up a stranger to all, including himself, of having to learn how to survive, to function all over again. The loneliness of traveling the road by himself, fighting off geckos, bloatflies, scorpions, death claws, with no one to watch his back or share his doubts, his hopes, or his dreams. Of being forced to witness the horror of Legion war crimes, of having to put down those who would have slowly died in anguish all because an indifferent world had left them with no hope of rescue. The frustration of being forced time and again to table his own quest as the desires and needs of others took center stage in places like Novak. He had traveled the Mojave from end to end so many times he had lost count, all because of Benny, and all of it with his hideous visage haunting the Courier's dreams every night. In this moment, there was no reason, no calculation, no logic, there was almost no thought at all. The instant that Benny stopped talking, driven entirely by uncontrollable rage and indignation, drew that little silenced .22 concealed in his armor, and fired. It was finally over. Benny, having run into an 18-carat run of bad luck, had cashed out. Justice had been satisfied. Or was it vengeance? The Courier couldn't tell anymore. He didn't care. He didn't know exactly what he expected. For some great weight to suddenly lift from his shoulders, some catharsis, a heavenly choir and a bright light shining down on him. In the end, it was just him standing alone in a room that smelled of hot sulfur and saltpeter, looking down at a corpse, a pile of rotting meat adorned in a fine suit. Almost as if it was second nature, he started stripping Benny's body. That custom-etched nickel-plated handgun that haunted his every waking moment, named Maria, was added to the Courier's pack. A fine plaid suit was now his as well. One by one, the things that made Benny stand out, that made him unique, memorable, that gave him character and defined his very existence, disappeared into the Courier's pack until the platinum chip, that little vehicle of fate itself, rested neatly in the palm of his hand. All that was left was to deliver it to House, and this nasty business would be behind him forever. But to what end? Would he return to the Mojave Express, delivering packages for meager payouts? Would he return to Good Springs to finally settle down? Or like Benny, was he now too corrupted to ever be allowed such a luxury as community and companionship? As the Courier stared down at his vanquished nemesis, a thought occurred to him. Benny wasn't stupid. Something allowed him to become the leader of the chairman, the most respected member of his tribe, House's most trusted human agent. Something must have happened to have given him such an inflated sense of self-worth, to believe he was untouchable, so close to victory. The Courier remembered House's suggestion that he look for computers. There were none here, but as he stared down at a small key in his hand he had taken from Benny, he decided to look into it. If nothing else, he could continue wiping any trace of Benny's existence from the face of the earth, making his victory complete. He wandered the hotel, the dining areas, the theater, the gloriously tasteful swimming pool that nobody seemed to have any particular interest in using. He rode the elevator up to the high roller floor patrolled by chairman's security guards. He snuck past them to a suite with large double doors. The key fit perfectly. In the back of the suite, he discovered a secret room hollowed out behind a closet. This room was filled with all manner of mechanical and electronic devices. They blipped, whirred, and otherwise bleeped along to the menial, repetitive tasks for which they were designed. And in the middle of it all, a securitron, not sporting the portrait of a friendly cowboy or a stern police officer or even a starlet of times long past. No, this one had a goofy, hastily scrawled scrawled cartoon character, a unique personality that couldn't have possibly made it past the H&H Tool Company's quality control department. No, this had to be a post-war personality. It identified itself as Yes Man, a specially programmed PDQ-88. Its primary function was to monitor House's networks and decrypt his secret transmissions. I guess that explains how Benny knew which courier to hit and what the real item of value was. Apparently, with the help of some lady friend living in a fort over in Freeside, Benny managed to reprogram Yes Man. I guess the followers unwittingly had a hand in the courier's darkest day. The plan was to get Yes Man loaded onto the Lucky 38's mainframe to take control of the securitrons, kill Mr. House, and then, well, Yes Man would just do whatever Benny had told him. Suddenly, the courier found himself standing in Benny's shoes, in Benny's workshop, with Benny's resources and everything that made him powerful in his possession. It was a crossroads. This wasn't the first time the courier had held real power. Somewhere down at the concierge desk in the Tops, among the other weapons confiscated when he entered, was the targeting device for the Archimedes superweapon, a weapon the courier had chosen to disable rather than wield. But for the first time, the courier found himself tempted to use the power that was presented to him. Throughout his journey, he had felt his morality chiseled away, all the while feeling his resentment of being small, being powerless, of being nobody gradually begin to fester and grow. As he stood here in this place, this machine giving him all the keys to Benny's would-be empire, he wasn't sure what to do. It would be so easy to surrender himself and become the very thing that he had sought to destroy in Benny. He had witnessed the cruelty of the Legion, the incompetence of the NCR, and the harsh indifference of House. The power he held would be potentially devastating if it fell into any of their hands. But each of these factions had also long since proven that, given the right resources, they could accomplish great things as well. Could he really be trusted to do better, to succeed where others in all likelihood would fail? Or would he eventually be warped and corrupted beyond all recognition? Only time could tell. But thankfully, time was something he suddenly had in abundance. He suddenly had no mission, no quest, no reason to rush across the Mojave from Nipton to North Vegas. And with House unaware of the happenings within the Tops, he had no way of knowing that Benny had suddenly disappeared. This wasn't a decision he needed to make right now. He simply strolled down to the concierge, collected his belongings, and stepped out onto the pavement. For the first time in a very long time, his actions would be dictated by him. Not by Benny, not by justice or vengeance, not even by Robert E. House himself. He shifted the weight of his pack, glanced up and down the strip, and checked his Pip-Boy. What happened next? Well, unlike war, the legend of the courier, it changes all the time, but I like to believe the version that goes a little something like this. This episode of Legends of the Mojave is thanks to my patrons over at Patreon. The impact their direct contributions make to the continued operation of Gray Gaming cannot be understated. Welcome to Coaset Alicorn, who recently enlisted as a Grunt tier patron. Special salute to my Officer tier patron Carver050, and continued thanks to all my non-coms who keep the grunts on point. All Patreon funds are reserved for investment directly back into Gray Gaming's production costs, but if you can't swing a monthly Patreon membership, there are other ways to help the channel that don't cost a penny. If you enjoyed the video, a like would go a long way to help the channel, as viewer engagement is the primary metric I use to determine the sort of content that provides the most value to you, a random person on the internet who has the power to choose if I can afford to splurge on a Sunset Sarsaparilla next time I stop off at Mick and Ralph's for supplies. Until my next salute, stand at ease. Thank you so much for watching to the end, stay safe, and I hope to see you here next time on Gray Gaming.